All right, let's just dive right into this because trust is one of those things we talk about literally every single day, yet we rarely ever stop to think about what it actually is on a structural, scientific level. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really multi-layered, completely paradigm-shifting view of trust. We're going to look at it not just as some moral virtue, but as a dynamic, living process that spans all the way from everyday social psychology right down into deep neural architecture. So, we've all heard the old cliche, right? Trust has to be earned. We tend to think of it as this fortress that has to be built brick by brick, super slowly over a long period of time. But is that actually true? Well, drawing on the research of Peter H. Kim in his book, How Trust Works, it turns out that humans actually default to trusting strangers. I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but think about it. You trust that other drivers are going to stay in their lane. You trust the barista making your coffee. You trust the random online store you just gave your credit card to. For pure evolutionary and social efficiency, we actually start relationships with a surprisingly high baseline of trust. Honestly, society just couldn't function otherwise. So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll cover the truth about trust. Then we'll get into the science of vulnerability, followed by competence versus integrity. Next, we'll look at why trust collapses so rapidly, and finally, we'll explore trust in the subconscious. Okay, Section 1, the truth about trust, looking at some common myths and our default states. First things first, we absolutely have to move away from the idea that trust is just blind faith or some warm, fuzzy feeling. It is a highly measurable, dynamic organizational process. It can spark rapidly, it can get distorted, it can collapse in a literal microsecond, and sometimes, under the exact right conditions, it can be repaired. And that brings us to a really fundamental definition used in organizational psychology. Trust is a willingness to accept vulnerability based on positive expectations. I really want you to focus on that one word, vulnerability, because if another person's behavior can't affect you, trust is completely unnecessary. You can absolutely like someone without trusting them, and you can trust the competence of a pilot without knowing a single thing about their personality. Basically, without risk, without having some actual skin in the game, trust simply does not exist. Moving right along to Section 2. The science of vulnerability, exploring continuity theory and the brain. Now, when we map this psychological idea directly onto the brain, we completely shift the paradigm from a social concept to a hard biological necessity. Here is the highly academic, neuroscience-backed definition of trust. Trust is the controlled delegation of homeostatic regulation under predicted continuity. I know that sounds incredibly dense, but let's unpack it with a really simple metaphor. Homeostatic regulation is basically just your brain's way of keeping you safe, balanced, and protected. So when you trust someone, you are temporarily handing them the steering wheel to your own nervous system and protective boundaries. You're delegating your personal safety to them because you're predicting that they'll act reliably. Think about how this actually plays out biologically. You'll realize that trust isn't at the foundation. At the very base of our operating system, we just have simple prediction. Every adaptive organism has to predict the future just to survive. From there, we evaluate safety, and we engage our self-protection. It's only when we get to the very top of that hierarchy that we reach trust. Basic prediction is a raw biological mechanism. Like, if I step on that ice, am I going to slip? But trust? Trust is a highly specialized higher-order judgment that's built right on top of those protective systems. It's asking, can I safely relinquish my protective control to this specific person? Which brings us to Section 3. Competence versus integrity, the two dimensions of trust. Whenever we're evaluating whether to hand over that steering wheel, we are constantly and unconsciously judging others on two very distinct dimensions. Peter H. Kim's research points out that we don't just ask, do I trust them, as one massive question. We actually split it into two. On one side, you have competence. That's functional continuity. Essentially, can this person actually do the job? And on the other side, you have integrity. That's structural continuity. Will they act honestly and stick to their principles? And this is incredibly crucial because we judge failures in these two areas entirely differently. If someone makes a mistake in skill, like let's say an accountant makes a math error, we can usually forgive it if they show they're improving. But a failure in morals, if that same accountant embezzles money, that shatters the trust structure entirely. Okay, Section 4. Why trust collapses rapidly, covering betrayals, mechanics, and repair. So this is probably the most painful part of our explainer, why trust breaks down so fast. We have all experienced this. One single betrayal can completely wipe out years of reliable, trustworthy behavior. But why? Well, it's because the brain is quite literally wired to weight negative information disproportionately. It is a strict survival mechanism. The reason a betrayal hurts so deeply mathematically is that it equals a prediction error plus lowered protective regulation. You didn't just make a bad guess. You actively lowered your emotional and biological defenses right before taking the hit. Your brain instantly learns a very harsh lesson. Lowering my protection exposed me to unacceptable harm, and that is exactly why your defenses immediately shoot back up, stronger and thicker than ever before. We can actually understand this breakdown using analogies straight from mechanical physics. If there's a minor disturbance, say your friend is late for dinner once, that's an elastic response. The relationship stretches out a bit, but it snaps right back to normal. Now, if there are repeated issues, we get a plastic response. The relationship survives, sure, but the shape of it has permanently changed. Your baseline expectations are lowered. But a massive betrayal, that causes a fracture. This is a totally destabilizing violation where the system actively reorganizes itself around a brand new concept, active distrust. And distrust is internally coherent, and it is highly, highly self-protective. Because of that fracture, repairing trust involves a fascinating concept called organizational hysteresis. Think about it like this. Say you start at an initial baseline of trust. Then you suffer a violation, and eventually, maybe with a lot of work, you reach a newly repaired state of trust. But that new state is never exactly the same as the original one. Why? Because your neural system, your brain, actually retains the historical data of the violation. It's just like a repaired vase. You're always going to see those faint glue lines. The current state of trust always depends partly on the history it took to get there. So how do you actually reach that repaired state? Well, Peter Kim lays out some very strict criteria for a successful apology. You definitely can't just say, "I'm sorry," and move on. You need clear acknowledgement, you have to take full responsibility, provide an explanation, show genuine remorse, take corrective action, and, crucially, establish future safeguards. And remember what we said about integrity? For an integrity violation, words alone are absolutely useless. Without concrete behavioral evidence proving that those future safeguards are really in place, apologies are almost always going to fail to restore trust. And finally, Section 5, Trust in the Subconscious, diving into dreams, memory, and intuition. Now, this is where the science gets genuinely mind-bending. How does our brain process trust when we aren't even consciously thinking about it? You know those moments where you just know you shouldn't trust someone, even if you can't articulate exactly why? To understand that, we have to look at how past experiences shape our feelings across different memory levels. Sometimes we have explicit recall. We know exactly why we don't trust them because we clearly remember them lying to us. Sometimes it's fragmentary. A situation just feels eerily familiar, but we can't quite place the memory. And sometimes it is pure implicit influence. We just get a bad vibe. What's happening is your brain is rapidly processing hundreds of micro-cues, facial expressions, vocal tones, past pattern similarities, and it performs this massive, complex calculation. Then, it just hands your conscious mind a simple gut feeling of intuitive distrust without ever showing you the math. And what's wild is that this non-conscious processing continues even when we are asleep. During waking life, obviously, we evaluate the external other right in front of us. But during dreaming, that external other is completely absent. We aren't explicitly sitting there asking, "Do I trust my coworker?" Instead, the external social relationship temporarily becomes an internally generated cognitive simulation.
As researchers put it, the dream scenario itself becomes the relational representation. That is absolutely fascinating. During REM sleep, our brain is effectively reorganizing the base components of trust: our memories, our emotions, our assessments of threat and safety. It's taking all the relational data from the day and recombining it in a safe internal sandbox before we wake up. It's literally updating our predictive models for the next morning.
So, to bring all of this together, trust is so much more than just a psychological feeling or a moral choice. It is quite literally an organizational technology of social continuity. It is the fundamental underlying mechanism that allows autonomous units, whether that's two friends hanging out, massive corporations, or even global civilizations, to selectively lower their boundaries, coordinate their actions, and actually thrive together despite all the uncertainty of the future. Which leaves us with this final, really powerful question to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer. Look at your own life, your own waking and dreaming relationships. Who are you giving the steering wheel to? Who are you delegating your homeostatic regulation to? Because every single time you trust, you are taking a massive biological leap of faith. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep exploring the incredible science behind how we connect.